Bold and risky are the two words that I would use to characterize Alien Isolation. In the AAA market, publishers are more risk-averse than ever, and we're always hearing Ubisoft or EA or whoever else going on and on about how you can't turn a profit unless you tick off checkboxes in their mass-produced blockbuster assembly line. And yet here's Alien Isolation shamelessly going its own direction, being tough as nails, being unforgiving, being a very, very slow burn, and it's not about combat and body counts, but you still do get a means to defend yourself. It carefully and faithfully handles the source material for an IP that's been fucked up repeatedly over the years. It's subtle, it's terrifying, it's a classic survival horror game with modern big-budget production values. And that kind of makes it a wonder that this was even greenlit at all. It shows a lot of confidence from Sega in creative assembly, so kudos to both of them. But standing out and being bold isn't enough to put it on this list. It wasn't enough to make it one of my favorite games of the year, because it not only tries to be a faithful homage to Alien, it not only tries to create a tension-rich atmosphere, it doesn't just try to make you paranoid that every vent you pass under could spell death. It succeeds. It succeeds with flying colors. Being stalked by this intelligent, unstoppable creature is every bit as tense and scary as it should be. Creative Assembly also showed a remarkable amount of restraint in building up to the alien, and in its presentation of the whole scenario. They talked a big game as well about how the AI was going to be so advanced, and the final game actually kind of met those expectations they built up, which is pretty rare. One of the most interesting things I found about the AI is that you can't even find solace in your motion tracker. This thing that's supposed to give you this sense of safety because you're fully situationally aware of everything going on around you. You can't even take solace in it because every subtle, quiet little blip of the motion tracker is just loud enough that if there's something nearby, it might attract attention if you leave it out too long. The game is full of these really brilliant little design decisions like that. It's claustrophobic, it makes you anxious and tense and scared. When I first heard about Alien Isolation when it was announced, I had no faith in this whatsoever, especially because the announcement came on the heels of the disaster that was Colonial Marines. But I was wrong, and Alien Isolation blew me away. I was really looking forward to Depth, but I thought, to be honest, that it was never going to come out because back in around 2012 or 2013, it was actually cancelled. So imagine my surprise when one day I load up Steam and I look in the new releases tab and just out of the blue, it's there. It's out. And to boot, it's great. I've always been a fan, since I was real young, of asynchronous multiplayer modes like this, ever since Alien vs. Predator 2 in 2001, where you could play as Marines, aliens, or Predators, all against each other. And they were all vastly different, and it's, to this day, one of my favorite games of all time. I love Natural Selection 2 for that same reason, I love Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2 for similar reasons. Now we have a competitive multiplayer game which pits divers against sharks, and it's every bit as radical as it sounds. As a diver, you constantly feel unsafe, visibility is low, and you not only have to be aware of what's going on your flanks, what's behind you, what's lurking just outside of vision ahead of you, but above and below. The dark, crushing abyss of the sea is your enemy, and the sharks are just its hitmen. So the divers have to watch each other's back constantly, they have to react instantly once a shark pounces. You have to try to spot the sharks and kill them before they can kill you or your friends. And meanwhile, the sharks have free reign of the sea. They can demolish walls and other objects, you can thrash and rip divers apart in your jaws, and you could just swarm them. The sharks move like little bullets ripping through the ocean. They are fast. As a shark, you can sense the divers, you have better awareness of what's going on around you, and to top that all off, there's a Megalodon mode, which is a twist on one of my all-time favorite multiplayer modes, which is kind of like a mix between Infection and King of the Hill, where one person is it. They are the Megalodon, they're hunting their prey to rack up points, and all of the divers are searching around for treasure to upgrade their weapons, so that they can try to take down this hulking Megalodon shark, and whoever kills the Megalodon becomes the Megalodon. Depth is everything I could have hoped for. It's exceeded all of my expectations. I don't know how long its legs are going to be as a competitive, thriving multiplayer game, but the value of the novelty is very, very high here. And it's something that I hope lasts a very long time. I hope it's successful. Freedom Wars has one of the coolest premises that I have seen in ages. You're a prisoner in a far future authoritarian society. The world's natural resources are dwindling, so they use their prisoners as soldiers to fight and repel the other nations from claiming the limited resources that are left. And they use the promise that every mission that you complete will deduct years from your sentence. But this society thrives on keeping you locked up because it's to their benefit. So once you're in, everything is designed to keep you in. Every errant action tacks on 10, 20, 30 years to your sentence. The first thing that happens in the game is that you come down with amnesia and you're charged with a reckless loss of memory. If you walk around your cell too much, you're charged with excessive exercise. That premise alone is amazing, but it's not just a good premise acting as window dressing for an otherwise mediocre game. No, 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 no. It's got gameplay to back up that awesome premise. It plays kind of like Monster Hunter meets Attack on Titan, but one of the core mechanics is a whip you get, which allows you to drag enemies around and to the ground. It lets you tether yourself to walls, it acts as a zipline or a grappling hook, so you can launch yourself at enemies. Without this one simple tool, the game would feel way, way worse to play. But as is, you're zipping around in the air, dashing in every direction, slicing monsters up like Levi in Attack on Titan. It's really, really cool. Smash for Wii U is my first Smash game. Somehow I just never got around to the original, or Brawl, or Melee, or any of those, so maybe that's gonna impact this ranking, but I don't care. Smash Wii U is just fun on its own merits. Plus, it's been a long time since I had to learn a new fighting game from the ground up, so going back to basics and having to even relearn how you learn a fighting game, what fundamentals to focus on, basic mechanics and controls, stuff like that, is awesome. Especially because Smash is fundamentally different from other fighting games. Surprisingly though, it's a lot easier to learn than you might think. In fact, I would say that Smash is easily the most accessible fighting game that I've ever played. Not only did it not take long to pick the basics up, I was actually able to enter some ranked matches even when I just booted the game up for the first time and do reasonably well, learn reasonably quick, and even win a few matches in the very early goings. That experience at a very basic level is way, way different from other fighting games. It's not terribly punishing for the inexperienced. A lot of fighting games, when you first play them, you will lose constantly, unless you are very, very familiar with the series or just basic fighting game fundamentals. You will just lose over and over again. You'll get pulverized into dust before you can actually build yourself up into an okay player. That hump is really, really tough for a lot of people who aren't familiar with fighting games, and it can wind up turning you off, because it can be pretty demoralizing to just lose 20, 30 matches in a row and feel like you're getting stomped before you round that corner finally. It's very different from other types of competitive multiplayer games, but the format of Smash Online plus the general simplicity and the accessibility of it makes it a lot easier to jump into. But when you start getting to higher level play and you start getting into 1v1, the nuance becomes very apparent, and the execution ceiling looms pretty high. Smash for Wii U is a classic example of easy to learn, hard to master. It's got a really good learning curve. It's great fun. There's a variety of unique characters, stages, modes. It's breadth and depth in abundance. Besides, Mega Man, how can you not love a game that gives us this?
Super fighting robot! Mega Man! Fighting to save the world!
Valiant Hearts is a somber depiction of the desolation of war through the historical lens of World War I. It invests you in a small cast of characters, and it zooms in to show you the emotional human toll that war takes. There are two ways to depict that kind of gloominess. You can go the Cormac McCarthy's The Road route, where the gloom and dolefulness is unrelenting and the grim realities of a horribly depressing world are bearing down on your doorstep without distraction, without relent. Or you can do it this way, where you have this sprightly comic book art style that gives you something bright and cheerful to latch onto, and it makes those low notes, the poison gas, the loss of friends and companions, the futility of war, a lot more stark and poignant and evocative by contrast. And while you're on this emotional ride through the quagmire of war, you're being peppered with historical facts that makes this kind of an interesting educational experience as well. And also, unlike a lot of narrative-focused indie games, Valiant Hearts also contains some pretty charming, clever, side-scrolling puzzle solving. That always takes a backseat to the story, but gameplay is never absent in this one. It's token, but appreciated. The game is profoundly engaging, and credit goes to Ubisoft Montpellier for this one. Their smaller projects are hitting it out of the park, and proving that you don't need a $50 million budget, or a bloated 20-hour game, or 800 developers slaving away to make something beautiful. Super Time Force is the most fresh game I've played all year. It's kinetic, frantic, tight fun with a genius gameplay hook, which revolves around time travel. So you can hit a button to rewind time as far back into the mission as you want, and replay whatever you were doing up to that point. The twist is that you're not just starting over, you're now playing alongside echoes of your past self or selves. You have a multitude of classes to choose from, so maybe you rewind half a dozen times and you're replaying the mission as a sniper alongside the 6 other characters who have a rocket launcher, demolishing everything ahead of you. All the classes feel really good and unique, by the way. So this mechanic leads to constant bouts of your jaw dropping, your mind being blown, these endless moments of awe-inspiring insight when you gradually comprehend what's going on. It's so cool. Like I said, the classes are varied, it controls very well, the boss fights are well designed and interesting, the stages as well, it all feels very tight, it's just chaotic fun, and it had me wide-eyed whooping and hollering on a regular basis. Plus, I didn't even mention that if you die and you rewind time, you can either kill the enemy that killed your past self and save your team member, and then you can use him as a power-up and get the abilities that he had in addition to your own. So you can go back in time to save yourself and gain your past self's power. Mechanically, this game just blows me away. It is an unbelievably good time playing Super Time Force. And on top of all that, the dialogue lampooning time travel tropes and pop culture is pretty well written, and something rare for a game, it's fucking hilarious. I cannot recommend Super Time Force enough. For the most part these days, a lot of indie developers choose pixel art because of budgetary constraints, because it's a little bit easier to do than really good-looking 3D graphics. But constraint often breeds innovation, so some pixel art styles vary a lot and they often look really beautiful for it. Still though, it's not too often that you see a developer limit themselves to NES restrictions intentionally in an attempt to be faithful to those limits. Shovel Knight is one of those. Almost every aspect of Shovel Knight is meant to adhere to the limits of the NES as a stylistic choice, with very few exceptions, mainly those that would limit the enjoyability of the gameplay. In those limitations, though, the folks at Yacht Club applied modern techniques and sensibilities to extract beauty from the limited color palettes and horsepower. It's lovely on the eyes and on the ears as well. Jake Kaufman does some of his best work on Shovel Knight's soundtrack. But most of all, those NES sensibilities influence the gameplay heavily. Old school Castlevania and Mega Man play really big roles here, among others. Taken on its own merits, though, removed from any of its influences, or nostalgia, or any of the things it apes, Shovel Knight is just damn fun. Its initial stages are maybe a little bit too simple, but after that, they all feature great level design, unique, quirky bosses with tons of personality, and just really solid action platforming gameplay, which does everything it has to do. It's so varied. Every stage has its own gimmick. Swinging the shovel feels great, pogoing feels great, jumping feels great. Every little minute detail is just perfect here. Any complaints I have about Shovel Knight are, at best, nitpicks. And there's no game that's beyond nitpicking, so Shovel Knight is as close as games come to being perfect. One round. Play just one round of Nidhogg, and it will transmute any doubt you have into hype. It is that compelling. Last year, I put Dive Kick in my top 10 because, despite being born from a joke, that two-button fighter relied entirely on often neglected fighting game fundamentals. Most people will go in and focus on advanced techniques, flashy combos and stuff first, ignoring the importance of stuff like positioning and character ranges, reading your opponent, playing mind games. Dive Kick was only about the latter. It was simple, but there was a lot of depth there. Nidhogg is very, very similar in that regard, with a little bit more control over your character. The same principles apply though. Your nondescript little blobby stick figure can roll, jump, throw a sword, raise it high, medium, or low, stab. That's generally about it. That's the gist of the way the controls work. You also have things like parries and disarming your opponent, sweeps, neck brace, and a few other things, but those controls can be learned over the course of like 1 or 2 5-minute rounds or less. You have just enough control, though, that this simple little tug-of-war trying to make it past your opponent to the opposite end of the screen and the opposite side of the arena becomes amazingly intense and hype, and you have just enough flexibility to make a seemingly infinite number of really cool plays. There aren't tons of modes, there are only a couple of levels, there aren't, crazy advanced techniques that I know of, but it's just so overwhelmingly exciting and involved that it became one of my favorite games of the whole year. Nobody I know would turn down a quick game of Nidhogg, and nobody I know has walked away from it not enjoying themselves. I could sit here and talk about the many flaws of Dark Souls 2 for an hour. The copious amounts of jank, the performance, the sketchy hitboxes, a few samey humanoid bosses, the bait-and-switch lighting downgrade, the weaker tertiary characters, soul memory just as a mechanic. But it should say a whole lot that in light of all those problems I just listed off, this was still my second favorite game that I played this year. And it's not up here because the other 8 games that I just talked about before aren't amazing, it's up here because it stands on its own as a great game, and there is so much good in Dark Souls 2 that it eclipses those flaws that tend to dominate the conversation. There is a staggering amount to do and to see. There's a variety of really beautiful environments. There's so many bosses, most of them being pretty good, pretty fun to fight. There's so many fun fights and enemies, some of my all-time favorites in Souls. It's got a near Demon Souls quality soundtrack. The PvP is vastly better than in any previous Souls game. The amount of weapon variety, the amount of unique moves, the flexibility, the amount of care and detail that goes into everything, it is a deep, deep rabbit hole to go down. It's got a compelling story that's supported by the lore of the last game, and it's got some interesting lore in its own right. So as much as I could sit here and talk about the flaws of the game for an hour, I could talk twice as long about how good it is with twice the enthusiasm about everything it gets right. Even down to little mechanical refinements and quality of life changes made in Dark Souls 2. And at the end of the day, it still feels like a Souls game, so that's always going to be a positive. It's heavy, it's methodical, it's tense. The bottom line is, I've played a few hundred hours of Dark Souls 2 at this point. I've loved it since moment 1, and I've not grown weary of it. And I'm not just making excuses up for it because I love Souls games. I love Devil May Cry, and I'll tell you that Devil May Cry 2 was garbage. I love Mega Man X, but I'm more than ready to shit-talk X7 as being god-awful. I love Silent Hill, but you will never catch me defending Homecoming. The reason that I and other fans of the Souls series can point out all the things wrong with Dark Souls is because we're fans of it. We are hypersensitive to the flaws of the game, but that should in no way overshadow what a great game Dark Souls 2 is. Nothing this year has peaked higher than Bayonetta 2. If you took Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and you turned it into the perfect action game, you would get Bayonetta, where substance and style are one and the same. You don't have to go for higher rankings, you don't have to use all the tools at your disposal. You don't have to do any of that, there's no pressure. You could just enjoy the manic scenes, the blistering pace, the awesome designs. the one-of-a-kind perfect game feel, and you would still get a pretty good experience. But at the same time, why not just style a little harder? Dig into this wide-open system and all of its subsystems that make up the meat of the game. Why not just see what you can do with all those shiny tools and push yourself a little bit harder? Those are the thoughts that constantly run through your mind when playing Bayonetta 2. And this is a game that you can never accuse of being lazy or holding back. It's insanity, and that extends to Bayonetta 2's glut of options and content. There are tons of techniques, accessories, combos, mechanics, techniques, weapons, modes, costumes, scenarios, all game-changing and demanding your attention to master. And all of those little details, all of those options, they're all lovingly crafted. Every weapon is unique, they all have unique properties and animations and moves and combos. There is an unbelievable amount of variety here. Trying to sum the sheer amount of stuff in Bayonetta 2 up is daunting. And it all goes back to that central hook though. Give the player tons of options to explore and style with. There is a vast ocean of content to wade through and explore with this game. All of this is why Bayonetta is Queen of the Hill. It's why Bayonetta 2 is the reigning, defending champion of the character action genre. Put simply, I haven't been as absorbed in a game, and I haven't had as much fun with a game, and I haven't had a harder time tearing myself away from any other game this year. This is why Bayonetta 2 is my game of the year for 2014.
Beautiful.
So that does it for my top 10 games of 2014. It's been a year of peaks and valleys, but the peaks were exquisitely high, and 2015 is shaping up to be a really awesome year for gaming. Speaking of next year, be sure to tune in tomorrow for my top 10 most anticipated games of 2015. Before I close this out, I want to just give a couple of honorable mentions real quick because I had an incredibly hard time paring this list down to just 10. I could have probably done a top 20 and still had to make some really, really hard decisions about what to cut. Anyway, just real quick, honorable mentions go to Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, Hyrule Warriors, Transistor, Guilty Gear Xrd, Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, Mario Kart 8, This War of Mine, and Neverending Nightmares. That's gonna do it for now. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take it easy. Have a good one.